I was 43 years old, deep in the Canadian wilderness about 200 miles north of the Manitoba border. It was March 1967, temperature hovering around minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit, and I'd been tracking a wolverine for 7 hours straight through dense spruce forest. My compass had frozen solid. The mercury inside had crystallized at minus 12 degrees, something I didn't know could happen until that exact moment. My map was useless without it. I had maybe 4 hours of daylight left, and I was nowhere close to my cabin. Every single person I knew in the trappers' community would have panicked. They would have stopped, built a fire, waited for dawn. But I did something different that day. I looked down at the moss growing on the north side of a fallen aspen tree, and I walked straight west, directly toward my cabin. And I made it back with 45 minutes of daylight to spare. That moss reading saved my life that day. But it wasn't the first time, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. Over the next 13 years, I used that same technique 47 times when compasses failed, when clouds obscured every star, when electronic equipment betrayed me. 47 times it kept me alive. I need to tell you something straight up. When I was young, in the early 1940s, I was like everyone else. I believed the compass was the answer to everything. I'd bought a decent Silva compass around 1941 for $8.30, and I treated it like a religion. Every person I knew in the trapping world did the same thing. We'd been taught by the old guides that if your compass worked, you never got lost. Simple as that. But between 1944 and 1952, I experienced something the standard trapper community never really talked about. I lost my way 6 times despite having a working compass. Not because the compass was wrong, but because I was reading it wrong, or because I was over-trusting it in situations where it was giving me false bearings due to mineral deposits in the rock. Once, in 1948, I was using my compass in what I later learned was an area with high iron ore concentrations. My bearing was off by 37 degrees. I thought I was heading east when I was actually heading north-northeast. I walked for 6 hours before I realized something was terribly wrong. I ended up in a lake I didn't recognize, nearly hypothermic, and I had to backtrack for 8 hours in the dark. That mistake cost me nearly losing 2 toes to frostbite. It was then that I discovered that the old-timers, the men who'd survived the longest in the wilderness, they weren't trusting compasses alone. The man who changed everything was named Robert Dean. He was about 74 years old when I met him in 1951 at a trading post near Fort Nelson. He'd been trapping in British Columbia since 1903, nearly 50 years by that point. He showed me something nobody else I knew had bothered to observe or teach. He said, "The trees will tell you more than any device ever will if you know how to listen." He spent an entire evening showing me how moss and lichen patterns work. The second source of knowledge came from living alongside the Dean people, who I'd had limited contact with, but who were incredibly generous with their knowledge once they realized I respected their methods. An older woman named Sarah, who was approximately 86 years old, taught me something that combined observation with what I'd later understand as basic directional logic. She explained that moss wasn't just a random growth pattern. It was a biological response to moisture and light. The science of it, in simple terms, is this. Moss grows where conditions favor photosynthesis and moisture retention. In the northern hemisphere, this predominantly occurs on the north side of trees because that's where shade is most consistent, where water drains from the warmer south side, and where the sun's UV radiation is weakest. It's not that moss only grows on the north side, that's what people get wrong. It's that moss grows thickest and most densely on the north side in most forest ecosystems. Robert told me one evening by the fire, "The moss is like a compass that never lies because it's not trying to tell you directions. It's just trying to survive. You point to where it's thick. That's the way the shadows fall all year long." I understood immediately what he meant. Now, let me be absolutely precise about what you need to collect before you even start this technique. First, you need to identify true lichen, not all green growth. Real tree lichen, the kind that matters for navigation, has very specific characteristics. It needs to be the crusty or branching variety, not the leafy kind. Look for Usnea or Avernia types, if you know those terms. But what matters is this. The lichen should be roughly 1 to 3 millimeters thick when it grows on the north side of trees in established forest. In temperate regions, you're looking at that accumulation pattern across multiple years. I'd typically see buildup that was approximately 4 to 7 millimeters thick on the north-facing side of trees that were at least 35 to 40 years old. Younger trees, saplings under 20 years old, often don't have enough lichen differentiation to be reliable. Second, you need actual moss, and this is where most people get confused. Not all green fuzz is moss that indicates direction. You're looking for feather moss or true moss species, the kind that feels soft and holds moisture visibly. This should be collected from the lower portions of the trunk, typically from ground level to about 4 feet up, and it needs to be from trees in a forest setting where they've been undisturbed for at least a decade. In open areas or recently cleared land, the growth patterns are compromised. Third, you need to identify comparison trees. You're never reading just one tree. In 1962, I started developing a system where I would examine a minimum of 5 to 7 separate trees before making a directional decision, all trees spaced at least 20 feet apart from each other to avoid shadow overlap. Fourth, you need to understand anomalies. Certain tree species have different lichen growth patterns than others. Spruce trees, which I worked with constantly in my 40 years, show lichen differentiation about 88% of the time in proper conditions. Pine trees showed this pattern about 73% of the time. Birch trees were less reliable, maybe 61%. I kept detailed records starting in 1953, and these percentages held consistently across different regions. The first major change I made to standard navigation practice was learning to approach trees systematically. Instead of glancing at a tree and assuming the moss side was north, I started performing what I called a full perimeter assessment. This took approximately 1 to 2 minutes per tree. I would walk completely around the tree in a full circle, starting at the north cardinal direction if I could determine it by any other means, even sun position. I'd examine the lichen density on all 4 sides, north, south, east, and west. I'd look at the thickness variation, which I'd record mentally as a ratio. On a black spruce in proper northern conditions, I'd typically see roughly 4 to 1 ratio of north side to south side lichen density. This was specific enough to be useful. The thick side, that's north. Then I'd move to the next tree approximately 20 to 30 meters away and repeat the process. I wasn't looking for perfect certainty. I was looking for pattern confirmation. By examining 5 to 7 trees this way, I could establish a consensus direction. The margin of error from this technique, based on my testing between 1956 and 1978, was approximately plus or minus 7 to 12 degrees, which was acceptable for wilderness navigation when I was trying to maintain a heading for distances up to 15 kilometers. The second major change involved understanding seasonal variation. When I first started this method, I thought moss growth was consistent year-round. I learned very quickly that it wasn't. In my notebook from 1954, I recorded that spring and early summer showed the most dramatic lichen differentiation, possibly because of the angle of sun radiation combined with increased moisture from snowmelt. By midsummer, around late July and August, the lichen patterns were less pronounced, because southern sides received more moisture from atmospheric humidity and rain. By fall, approximately mid-September through October, the pattern re-established itself. Winter was interesting because snow cover on the south side of trees actually made the north side lichen more visible by contrast, even though the lichen itself wasn't actively growing. This knowledge meant I had to adjust my interpretation based on calendar month. A reading I made in June wasn't worth as much as a reading I made in September. I factored this into my decision-making process. The third major change was learning to account for tree species variations and local ecology. Not every forest has the same lichen composition. I trapped across 3 distinct biomes between 1944 and 1983. The boreal forests of northern Canada had different lichen communities than the mixed forests of British Columbia, which were different again from the subarctic regions where I spent my last 15 years of trapping. By 1960, I developed a mental catalog of regional lichen patterns. For example, the lichen I relied on most heavily in the boreal regions was Evernia mesomorpha, which showed north-side preference about 89% of the time. In more temperate regions of British Columbia, I dealt with Ramalina species, which showed only about 67% north-side preference. This meant I couldn't use the exact same reading system everywhere. I had to recalibrate my confidence levels. In regions where I was less familiar, I used more trees in my consensus reading, sometimes 8 to 10 instead of 5 to 7. The fourth element addressed the problem of compromised readings. There are situations where moss and lichen readings become unreliable, and I learned to identify these early. Dense shade from tall tree canopies reduces lichen growth overall, but it also typically maintains the north-south differentiation while reducing absolute lichen volume. I could usually work around this. The real problem was edge effects in disturbed areas. If I came to a clearing where trees had been recently blown down or an area that had been logged or burned within the last 15 to 20 years, the lichen patterns were completely unreliable. Young growth trees just don't have sufficient lichen accumulation. After I got lost in 1957 because I didn't recognize that an area had been heavily logged in the early 1950s, I added a rule to my system. I would never make a directional decision based on trees less than 40 years old. I'd estimate tree age by diameter. Trees with a diameter under 6 inches at breast height, roughly 15 centimeters, I considered unreliable. Anything above 8 to 10 inches in diameter, I could usually rely on their lichen patterns with reasonable confidence. This added a filter to my navigation process. The fifth element involved cross-reference confirmation. By 1959, I realized I should never rely on lichen reading alone, even though the technique was incredibly effective. I combined it with 3 other observation methods. First, wind patterns. If I'd established wind direction for any length of time, the trees leaned slightly in the direction the wind came from. This was reliable over long periods. Second, water flow. If I found a stream or water seepage, I knew water flows downhill, and in my trapline areas, downhill typically meant south to southeast, heading toward lower elevations. Third, sun position when visible. In June, at 60-degree north latitude where I spent much of my time, the sun in the morning was more northeasterly, by noon more northerly, and by evening it was more northwesterly. These 3 reference points combined with my lichen reading gave me 4 independent data sources. I could usually establish a direction with reasonable confidence even in challenging conditions. My first major field test of this system came in late September 1956. I was in northwestern British Columbia, approximately 240 kilometers northeast of Fort Nelson. I'd been tracking a lynx for 9 hours across terrain I'd never covered before. Temperature was around 5 degrees Fahrenheit with snow cover of approximately 14 centimeters. My compass worked, but I wanted to verify my bearing using the lichen method instead. Using my 5-tree consensus approach, I established a north bearing that was approximately 4 degrees different from my compass bearing. My compass said 0 degrees. My lichen reading said about 4 degrees east of north. I proceeded using my lichen reading. When I finally reached a landmark, I knew, a specific rock formation I'd seen in previous seasons. I was able to verify the result. The lichen bearing had been more accurate. My compass had been affected by mineral deposits in the rock, something I later confirmed when I examined similar rock in that region. Over the next 13 years, until 1969, I conducted approximately 137 specific tests of this system where I could verify results against known landmarks. In 93 of those tests, the lichen reading was more accurate than my compass. In 28 tests, they were essentially equal. In 16 tests, the compass was more accurate. This gave me roughly a 68% confidence advantage for the lichen method, which is why I started using it preferentially. The before and after comparison is stark. Before I developed this system, I estimated I was getting lost or significantly misorienting myself roughly once every 50 to 60 hours of wilderness travel. This worked out to approximately once every 2 to 3 weeks during my active trapping season. After I implemented the systematic lichen reading approach, combined with cross-reference confirmation, that rate dropped to approximately once every 300 to 400 hours. That's roughly once every 4 to 5 seasons of heavy trapping activity. The practical impact was enormous. I stopped making rescue mistakes. I stopped having to double back. I stopped burning through rations because I'd overestimated my position and ended up needing more food than I'd anticipated. Between 1956 and 1969, during those 13 years where I methodically used this technique and documented results, I counted exactly 47 situations where this technique prevented me from becoming seriously lost or disoriented. 47 specific instances. I wrote them down. Every single one involved terrain I didn't know well, conditions that compromised standard compass reliability, or situations where I was navigating during periods of poor visibility. The specific uses of this technique throughout the decades remained consistent. I used it most heavily between 1956 and 1979 during my most active trapping years. After 1979, when I had access to better equipment, I used it less frequently, but it remained my backup system. In 1967, that day, I mentioned at the start the compass failure. That was the first time I successfully navigated purely on lichen reading without any compass backup. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. By 1973, the technique was second nature. I'd done it hundreds of times. By 1979, I'd done it thousands of times. The applications are remarkably consistent. Whenever I had any doubt about my bearing, I spent an extra 2 to 3 minutes checking lichen patterns on 5 to 7 trees. It added minimal time to my journey, but improved my reliability dramatically. In the modern context, this technique is more relevant than ever, even though most people don't realize it. GPS systems fail, batteries die, magnetic storms can affect compasses, although this was less understood in my era. Electronics are great, but they can't replace biological and geological observation. I've watched young people rely entirely on phones and GPS units. When those systems fail, and they will fail, people panic because they've never learned to read the environment. This technique is backup insurance. It's the kind of knowledge that costs nothing to acquire and potentially saves everything. The universal principle behind this is simple. Learn to observe what nature is already telling you. Every organism in the wilderness is responding to environmental conditions. Moss and lichen are responding to light and moisture. Trees are responding to wind. Water is responding to gravity. These aren't mysteries. They're just systems that take time to understand. If you can read those systems, you never truly get lost. You might be temporarily disoriented, but disoriented people can observe, problem solve, and survive. Lost people panic. Look, I spent 40 years learning these techniques the hardest way possible alone in the cold, making mistakes that almost cost me my life. My goal with this channel is to give you all that knowledge without you having to go through what I went through. If you want to learn more techniques like this, things that really work when you need them most, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. Leave a like if this video was useful, and tell me in the comments. Have you ever been in a situation where this technique would have saved you? And if you want to see another technique that saved me even more times, click on the video that will appear on screen. It's about reading animal sign to navigate in complete darkness. Remember that this channel presents fictional stories for educational purposes with production assisted by artificial intelligence. See you next time, and stay safe out there.